Welcome to Town Hall 132. It's my turn for the weekly welcome because we want to head over to our featured speaker, Neil Cassina, as soon as possible for a continuation from last week's very popular session. So thank you, Neil, for the shout out to Art Talks last week. And thank you to so many audience members who have expressed the same sentiment. So this week we selected an artist that might spark extra interest for Neil. Percy Wyndham Lewis was commissioned by the British to paint images of World War I and II. But why did the British want artists painting pictures for the various battle scenes when photography was invented in the 1800s? So we reached out to our resident Brit and asked Dick Esom. He said, I don't know for sure, but for me, a painting has an element of expressionism or abstraction that a photograph just can't capture. And there wasn't a lot of color photography in World War I and II in those times. So let's compare these two images and think about which do you prefer. They're of the same scene, and yet they have so many different aspects to them. So this could be part of the reason why they employed an artist to paint instead of just photograph. Now on to our artist for this week, Percy Wyndham Lewis. He was born in 1882 in Nova Scotia to British parents and eventually moved back to England around the age of 6. He attended boarding school and went on to attend the Slade School of Art, which is England's most prestigious art academy. Post-school, he traveled throughout Europe, eventually settling back in London. From 1913 to 1915, Lewis developed the style of geometric abstraction for which he's best known today, dubbed Vorticism. So here's a piece that exemplifies the style. Lewis sought to combine the strong structure of Cubism, which he found was not alive enough, with the liveliness of futurist art, which he thought lacked the structure. So the combination was a strikingly dramatic critique of modernity. This piece was published in a journal/manifesto called Blast that aimed to act as a wrecking ball on what Lewis saw as the hypocrisy and small-mindedness of Victorian Britain. This is a watercolor painting that he did in 1918. Lewis himself was posted to the Western Front and served as a second lieutenant in the Royal Artillery. So much of his time was spent in forward observation posts looking down at apparently deserted German lines, registering targets and calling down fire from batteries massed around the rim of the Ypres region in Belgium. He was made official war artists for both the Canadian and the British governments, and so this piece is likely from the area of Ypres in Belgium. Again painted in 1918, Officers and Signalers features 5 figures walking up a steep incline. The 3 figures at the rear are ducking to avoid a bomb blast, while the other 2 walk on. The last 2 figures in the group are officers wearing knee boots and carrying walking sticks, one wearing a trench coat. And it's his signature style of Vorticism with those sharp lines of Cubism and the sleekness of Futurism. As I mentioned, Wyndham Lewis was a painter for both Canada and the UK. But a battery shelled, this piece would not have been accepted by the Canadian War Memorials Committee, as Cubist work was deemed inadmissible. This work, however, arguably his most famous, was commissioned by the British War Memorials Committee, who allowed the artist greater creative freedom. The heavily stylized composition shows the scene from the First World War, in which enemy barrages were being suppressed by counter battery work. The 3 soldiers in the foreground, rendered in dark greens, blue, and black, look in different directions, standing calmly before the devastation in the background. The cold expressions of the 3 soldiers match the palette and this cold, emotionless detachment with which he presents this scene. Lewis described the First World War as, quote, a black solid mass, cutting off all that went before it. This piece depicts the boredom and physical labor involved in what could also be very dangerous work. Lewis drew on his own experiences in the artillery for this piece, which shows 10 soldiers in the foreground of a gun pit preparing the shells to be shot from the enormous gun on the left. The surrender of Barcelona was made from 1934 to 1937. It's also known as the Siege of Barcelona. And the painting was made around the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. Art critic Jeffrey Myers says, quote, "The theme of the picture is the fall of a peaceful open city, the submission to a brutal military occupation, and the effect of war, siege, and surrender on a civilian metropolis." This piece, representing a scene in a Canadian brass foundry, was Lewis's only contribution to the war artist scheme of the Second World War. He was stranded in Canada at this time and short on money, and so he wrote to the War Artists Advisory Committee, who agreed to commission an oil or drawing. And he later explained, "It's a busy scene in a factory. There was a great deal of smoke, steam, and not a great deal of light." So some tough working conditions. So we're jumping around in time a little bit, but this piece is so striking. It's very, very modern. And I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if I saw this piece at the Broad today or MoMA, but this was painted in 1914 and 15. Workshop was an early Vorticist work representing the crowding towers and architecture of the city on a cusp of war. Bold geometric lines extend diagonally across the canvas, abstracting the blocks and walls of a growing London, lending itself to some claustrophobia. And there's this sharp contrast between the blue, the one little square of blue representing a tiny patch of nature, and the many browns and pinks that represent the man-made. In 1930, Lewis married Gladys Ann Hoskins, 18 years his junior, and affectionately known as Frau Anna. Lewis kept Frau Anna in the background, and many of his friends were unaware of her existence even. But she was the model for some of Lewis's more tender and intimate portraits as seen here, as well as a number of characters in his fiction writing. In contrast to his earlier, more impersonal portraits and stoic faces that he painted, which are purely concerned with external appearance, the portraits of Frau Anna show a preoccupation with the inner life and the inner self. In recent years, there's been renewed critical and biographical interest in Lewis and his work. He's now regarded as a major British artist and writer of the 20th century. A quote from him reads, quote, "The artist is always engaged in writing a detailed history of the future because he's the only person aware of the nature of the present." Fellow artist Robert Montgomery said of him, "He was one of the really important English modernists, a painter and a writer, that very rare thing in British art, a real polymath." Thanks, everyone. And now on to the SMA studio.
Thank you, Sarah. This is so interesting, and I love the paintings. You know, I saw this art and more at the Imperial War Museum in London. Commissioning artists was an unprecedented act of government sponsorship of the arts. And welcome, Alan.
Thank you, Jacques. Yeah, as Dick Eason pointed out, there were several official war artists that were included, including Lewis, who we just saw, and then Paul Nash, who was painted the air battle scene at the beginning of the talk.
Yep.
So, and I believe that Paul Nash is going to be featured on a future art talk.
Yeah, I think that's right. That would definitely not surprise me.